It would be an understatement to say that I am an absolutely huge fan of Jonathan Rauch. It's the 20th anniversary of his book, Kindly Inquisitors. Kindly Inquisitors, I really do put up there with On Liberty as among my favorite defenses of freedom of speech that I've ever read. It is concise, it is beautiful, it is elegant, and it is a moral defense. It's not a merely legalistic defense of why free speech matters. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of context, Jonathan would talk about how we've turned into a society where there's an offendedness sweepstakes. And just this past month, the University of Edinburgh and 5 other universities in the United Kingdom banned the song Blurred Lines because they thought it was offensive to women. The university that gave us David Hume is banning a Robin Thicke song. And Jonathan Rauch saw this coming. Jonathan is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's an editor for Atlantic.com. He's written on everything from gay marriage to how to take care of your introvert. I'm a huge fan, and on that I'll hand off to John.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for the great work that you do at FIRE. I'm John Tierney. I'm a science columnist for the New York Times, the author of Willpower, and a huge fan also of Jonathan's book. This is something that it's not that often that a journalist writes a book that 20 years later is even better than it was then. It is such a wonderful defense of free speech. And what's wonderful about it also is that you take seriously the objections to people who say that they're to offensive speech. And you talk about the different defenses there are for why we should limit certain kinds of speech. And you make a great explanation. As a science columnist, I was really intrigued by this, about liberal science being one of the 3 things that Adam Smith's invisible hand gave us. There's liberal democracy, there's the capitalist system, and liberal science. Do you want to just start by explaining what liberal science is?
I would love to. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take a moment of personal privilege and thank Fire and Reason for this wonderful event. I've never spoken at the Museum of Sex before. I have to say, when someone hands you this at the Museum of Sex, you do wonder where it's been, but it's and thank you all especially for coming tonight. But without the support of Greg and Matt, this revised edition, the expanded edition of Kindly Inquisitors, would not have happened. It very literally happened at the suggestion of a FIRE staff member who said, you know, that book's 20 years old and we love it and you really should bring it up to date and bring it out as an ebook, and that's what set all of this off. So I owe all of you a lot of thanks. Mm-hmm. So liberal science, this was born out of frustration during the Salman Rushdie affair of the late 80s, which you're old enough to remember. And to the extent anyone was able to defend freedom of thought at all, it was legalistic. It was First Amendment. It was what does the Constitution say, without understanding what we were actually trying to do here. I had a background at Yale in history of science, and believed, and based on work I'd done and that others had done, that science is the third and actually the greatest of our liberal social systems. The great problem in society is how you deal with conflict. If it's conflict over resources, you use markets, and what it is that the token that you use is exchange of goods, of commodities, of services. In politics, you're allocating power, and the mechanism you use is exchange of compromise and votes. Well, in intellectual life, the question is who is right, who has the truth? And you deal with that through exchange of criticism. Everyone gets to talk, everyone gets to put hypotheses out there, all get criticized. There's no end to this game. It is, like all liberal systems, it's an open-ended, depersonalized, rule-based system. And at the end of the day, whichever hypotheses are still standing is our knowledge, always subject to further change. It depends on criticism. In fact, it vitally depends on offending people. That's the foundation of it. But a lot of people had forgotten that, and they thought it's all supposed to be people in white lab coats being nice to each other. Well, that's not really where knowledge comes from.
And it's not the experimental method that sets science apart. It's the social method, this method of finding truth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is the great insight of a philosopher named Charles Sanders Peirce. Has anyone heard of him? Greatest of all American philosophers. A few people have? Wow.
He often came to the Museum of Sex, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure he did. Though he died in, 1910?
He was early.
They were kinky in those days. You know what they said about the Victorians and the piano legs?
Yes.
Yeah, so he was, You shouldn't interview me here. It's not safe.
Feel free to offend anyone here, though.
He was way ahead of his time, but he was the first to understand that the difference ultimately between scientists, the scientific enterprise writ large, that includes not just hard science, but the humanities. It includes journalism, it's historians, it's everybody trying to find truth, is not that you're performing an experiment, because you can do that alone. What he pointed out is that if you've got a person working in the privacy of his own room, never talking to anyone, there's absolutely no way to tell the difference, even in principle, between Einstein and the genius. Between Einstein and a fool, Einstein and a raving lunatic. You know, they're both scribbling equations on the board and stuff. The key test is, do you then subject those ideas to repeatable public experiments and public criticism, such that anyone can have at them? That's how you know the difference between Einstein and the madman. It's a social system for making knowledge, and it turns out to be fantastically good at two things. One is finding the needles in the haystack, those bits of knowledge in the vast amounts of dross that come out every day, most of what most people hypothesize is wrong. Second, it's very good at keeping the peace, because by definition, no one can be in charge of it. Mm-hmm. It's a public criticism system, and it's a rolling public consensus. Mm-hmm. So you don't get the creed wars, and you don't get the radical disruptions that you do in authoritarian systems of knowledge construction.
And there are two laws to it, you say, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. No final say, no special authority. I've seen you've read the book.
Yeah.
But have you bought the book? The book is divided into two halves. For those of you who have never actually read Kindly Inquisitors in the original edition, the first half is about liberal science and how it works. Liberal science, our knowledge-producing system. And these two rules, no final say, no special authority, which are the rules of all liberal systems. Voting, markets. The point is, it doesn't matter who you are, no special authority. Everyone basically follows the same rules. You get one vote each. You follow pricing signals. You subject yourself to criticism, and no final say. The system never comes to a final result. There's no outside platform from which to say, this is the right answer, you have to reach this answer. So there's no monarch, there's no final fixed distribution of goods or prices, and there's no final knowledge. So it's a liberal system, open-ended, rules-based. So who does not like that? Well, there are some people who don't like it because they're Hitler. Or because they're the KKK. But I would argue those people are not most people who don't like it. Most people who don't like it are uncomfortable with it for reasons that actually speak well of them. They think that the results of the system are not fair. For example, if you're an Afrocentrist, you're going to say, this science has excluded my people's history, for example. I think that's wrong, but they're well motivated. But more important, the great challenge to liberal science, and the one that I think has emerged as important over the last 20 years since the book was first written, is what I call the humanitarian challenge. I say there are two, egalitarian and humanitarian. Egalitarians say we have a platform of fairness from outside the system. These results aren't fair, so let's change the results. So, let's go in the schools and teach creationism. That hasn't done so well. The other is the humanitarian challenge. And those are people who are saying, look, this system allows people to get hurt. In fact, it often makes a point of hurting people because it is criticizing people. And sometimes it allows people to behave in hateful ways. If you're gay, you know all about what it's like to live in a society that is full of anti-gay speech, anti-gay thought. Why would we allow that? Why would we allow, for example, racist rhetoric? This is hurtful, it's discriminatory. The big change in the last 20 years is a much more sophisticated version of this, which is it's a hostile environment doctrine. It says
Version 2.0,
yeah,
call
version
it, right?
2.0. I wrote this afterward to this electronic edition that says what's happened in the last 20 years. And it says that the big thing that's happened is it used to just be, well, Greg Lukianoff offended me, and that hurt my feelings, and I'm a minority because I'm gay. You're a homophobe. We need to discipline you and throw you out of this school or re-educate you. It's a good thing they're not really saying that as much anymore. They're now saying, look, it's an objective standard. It's not, did Greg hurt my feelings? It's is what he and other people saying create an environment, a social environment that's hostile to me as a minority, such that I can't participate equally in society. So that's a new, I would argue, and different kind of challenge. And that's where what I try to take on in the afterward. Where I might disagree with George Will is I see these people as well-motivated, misguided, but well-motivated. And I think in order to effectively counter them, I think we need to assume that too.
Right.
I was born in 1960. You guys can do the math. The hairline says it all. And I'm gay. And in the world I grew up in, until really quite recently, the list is endless. Couldn't serve in the military. Every form of government discrimination, every form of private discrimination, fired from our jobs, arrested by the police. But more than that, it was a given in that society. It was saturated with anti-gay sentiment, with bigotry, with the assumption that we were sick, that we were evil, that we were a threat to kids, we were a threat to social stability, we were gross, we were sinful. Everywhere you looked. It was built in. It was part of the background assumption of the society in those days. And then I thought, well, so is there an argument for a hate speech law in a society like that? But the question answers itself when you ask yourself in 1968, 1955, 1953, did you all know this? A U.S. senator shot himself in his office because J. Edgar Hoover was threatening to out his son as gay, as part of a deliberate political plot by Hoover and others to get this guy out of the way. I mean, this was going on in America. So it was really bad. And I said, well, you know, you're not going to get a hate crimes law passed to protect gay people in that environment. In fact, you'll get a hate crimes law that represses gay people because our speech will be hateful and a threat to children. It's going to be protect children from this harmful speech. You don't get hate crimes laws protection. In fact, you don't even get to make the case for them until after society has turned that corner and is willing to hear your case. So then I began asking myself, okay, so if hate crimes laws are the cart, what is the horse? What drove this change? And that's a lot of what the afterword is about. A lot of it is about an incredible man named Frank Kameny. Some of you might know him. I see a few heads nodding. Does anyone know the name Frank Kameny? Oh, well, can we get to that at some point?
No,
I can
please,
tell the story.
it's a great story. Please tell the story about
All
that.
right, well, I'll finish the big point and then come back to the small point. The big point is the reason we were able to make the progress we were against hate is that hate of this kind is not usually motivated by people who want to hurt other people. It's not, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. It's people with wrong ideas, orthodoxies that are stale, that are discriminatory, but they believe these falsehoods. They believe that Jews control the international financial system. They believe that blacks are inferior and can't, and are a threat to white women. They believe that gays undermine the social order and try to seduce children. Well, if someone thinks I'm a threat to their children or family, they will hate me. The way we went after that was by exposing the wrongness of their ideas, by showing that we were not dangerous or a threat. And the way we did that was by using to the hilt the system of public criticism we call liberal science. And sure enough, when exposed to criticism, these anti-gay views, they crumbled. They were indefensible. There was never any evidence for them. There was never any coherence to them. That's the mechanism by which we triumph. So I'm arguing in the afterword that in some indirect sense, hate speech is minorities' friends. It makes us push back, and in a climate that allows hate speech also allows us to answer the hate speech, and we will win over time. So how do we win? The story of Frank Kameny?
Sure.
So when I tell this story, I get emotional. I knew this guy, and it's hard to tell without, but I'm fine. I just love to tell the story anyway. So Frank Kameny, born in 1925, serves in the U.S. Army in the front lines in Italy during World War II, serves valiantly, goes on to get a PhD, becomes a scientist, an astronomer by training, goes to work for the U.S. Army Map Service. 1957 is caught in a police sting, and I think Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C. And the police, of course, were in the business in those days of harassing gay people, and was fired from his government job as a result because he had an arrest record and he was queer, he was gay. In those days, if you were gay, you could not work for the US government. Most people in that situation in the 50s understandably crawled away. Some of them killed themselves. Frank Kameny was different. Frank Kameny fought back. He appealed to the US Civil Service Commission, as it was then called. It's now called the Office of Personnel Management, a point we'll come back to. They wouldn't even hear the case. They simply said, this is the rule. He then went to Congress. He wrote letters. He got letters back from members of Congress saying things like, in all my years in this House of Representatives, yours is the most disgusting letter I have ever received. He then argued a case, took the case himself, acting as his own lawyer, to the US Supreme Court. They, of course, did not grant cert, but he wrote what's now a classic brief. Frank was a liberal in the old school. He believes that the Declaration of Independence was a promise that had been personally made to him, and that what had happened to him was a betrayal of that promise. And he said so in the brief to the Supreme Court. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I went to Europe to fight tyranny overseas only to come home and discover that I must now fight the tyranny of my own government against me. Supreme Court did not hear his case. So he then begins representing other gay people who've been fired from their jobs because he's willing to do it and he knows the rules. He loses those. One of those is an employee of the member of Library of Congress. They were firing people. 1965, he leads the first gay civil rights protest. Picketers in front of the White House and picketers in Independence Hall. In 1971, he's the first openly gay candidate for Congress. He forms the Mattachine Society of Washington, the first homophile group. In 1972, he manages to seize the microphone at the American Psychiatric Association meeting in Washington, D.C., and tells the assembled psychiatric establishment to its face that they are committing a campaign of extermination against homosexuals. That's how he puts it. This is Kameny crusaded for 30 years to repeal the sodomy law in the District of Columbia. He did all of this and more. So then the gay marriage movement comes along, and he's too libertarian to be all that interested in marriage, and he and he kind of fades from sight. But all those things he did cumulatively made a difference again and again. You know, one of the things that proponents of hate speech law say is that hate speech silences minorities. Well, it silences a lot of members of minorities, but others it forces forward. You get your Frank Kamenys, and the great thing about liberal science is you don't need that many Galileos or Kings or Kamenys. What it's great at doing is surfacing these ideas, testing them, and if they're better ideas, and Kamenys were better ideas, bringing them to the center of the debate. So the end of the story, and the part where I always choke up, is that Kameny lives to see the following things happen. He died in 2011. But by that point, in 2007, his papers, including a letter from the Library of Congress denying the appeal of the fired Library of Congress employee, his papers are accepted into the Civil Rights Collection of the Library of Congress. So that's fun. His original picket signs, which survived in his attic, joined the Smithsonian Civil Rights Collection and are displayed next to Jefferson's writing desk. He lives to see this, gives a little speech. It was really fun. In 2009, he receives the pen from Obama when Obama signs some federal benefits, partner benefits for civil servants. In 2011, he's in the front row to watch the signing of the bill overturning Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But my favorite bit is that I think it's 2010, he is given a special ceremony in which the Office of Personnel Management, which is the successor, it's the same agency that fired him, was the Civil Service Commission, gives Kameny a public apology for his firing. they give him their highest award, which is the Theodore Roosevelt Prize. And my favorite detail is that the director of the Office of Office of Personnel Management, who gives him this prize, is, you can see this coming, right? Openly gay. Kameny, yeah, I mean, what can you say in the face of that kind of courage? Kameny, by the way, at this ceremony, responds typical Frank way. He says, he sort of rises from a chair and says, "Apology accepted." So this is the power of speech, of thought. He didn't have money. He didn't have votes. He didn't have anything. He had the power of ideas.